The sky was heavy, draped in low, unmoving clouds that seemed to hold their breath. It wasn't raining, but the air felt thick, as if the world had paused, unsure whether to move forward. James Carter stood on the porch of his modest home in Willow Grove Estates, adjusting his black tie with trembling hands. His shoes were scuffed, his eyes bloodshot, his chest hollowed out by a grief so deep it left no room for anything else. He hadn't eaten in days. Sleep was a distant memory. All he could do was keep moving. Today was Lily's funeral. Lily, his 6-year-old daughter, had been taken by leukemia after a grueling year of hospital stays, fleeting hopes, and pain no child should endure. She had wanted a white casket. A fairy box. She'd called it in a faint whisper during her final days. James had promised her that, and he'd kept his word. The casket now rested in the hearse, small and delicate, adorned with pale blue ribbons and stickers of moons and flowers placed by her cousins. A worn stuffed bunny sat on top, the one she'd clutched through every hospital night. Behind the hearse, cars lined the street, their headlights dim in the gray light, forming a solemn procession of family, friends, coworkers, and neighbors, some strangers until Lily's diagnosis brought them together. No one spoke. The silence was heavy, broken only by the soft rustle of tissues and the occasional stifled sob. James stepped off the porch and nodded to the driver. It was time. The hearse crept forward, leading the procession toward the community's main gate, then along Maple Lane to Rosewood Cemetery, where Lily would rest beneath a willow tree James had chosen himself. But as they neared the entrance of their quiet, HOA-governed neighborhood, the procession jerked to a halt. A figure stood in the road, wearing a bright orange vest, clutching a clipboard, her face set like stone. Margaret Hensley, the HOA president. She raised one hand, palm out, and stepped in front of the hearse, her posture unyielding. The driver stopped, bewildered. James hurried forward, his heart pounding. Surely this was a mistake. "Margaret," he said, his voice barely audible. "My daughter's in that hearse." Margaret's eyes didn't waver. Her voice cut through the stillness, sharp and cold. "This is an unapproved event. No prior notice. It violates HOA regulations." The words landed like a slap. The driver glanced at James, then back at Margaret, frozen. James blinked, his mind struggling to process. "What?" he whispered. Behind him, car doors opened. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. A woman in the third car began to sob. James's ex-wife, Claire, stumbled out of a vehicle, collapsing onto the curb, her cries raw and shattering. The white casket sat motionless in the hearse, its blue ribbons fluttering faintly in the breeze. But the road to Lily's final resting place was blocked, not by fate, but by a clipboard and a rule. Margaret stood firm, her grip tightening on the clipboard. "This procession wasn't submitted for review," she said, her tone clipped. "You're obstructing a private roadway. That's against protocol." Protocol. The word hung in the air, absurd and cruel. James's jaw clenched, his breath caught between rage and disbelief. "It's my daughter's funeral," he said, louder now, his voice cracking. Margaret didn't flinch. "Rules apply to everyone, James. Without them, we have chaos." The crowd grew restless. Someone cursed. Another shouted, "Let them through!" Claire's sobs grew louder, piercing the tense silence. Margaret pulled out her phone and spoke calmly. "This is Margaret Hensley, HOA president. I need security at the front gate for a disturbance." A pause. "Yes, a funeral procession." Unauthorized and disruptive. She hung up, then made another call. "Non-emergency line?" "I'm reporting a traffic obstruction on private property. No prior approval." James stood frozen, surrounded by the hum of engines, the growing outrage, and the surreal sight of a woman using bureaucracy to halt a child's funeral. The crowd pressed closer, their anger palpable. A man yelled, "Have you no shame?" Margaret didn't respond. She stood like a sentinel, convinced of her righteousness. By evening, the story had exploded. Local news vans were parked outside Willow Grove Estates. HOA president blocks child's funeral, screamed headlines. Social media erupted with hashtags, hashtag let Lily rest, hashtag HOA horror. Clips of the standoff went viral. The white casket, James's stunned face, Margaret's raised hand like a stop sign against grief. Reddit threads dissected the HOA bylaws, while comments raged. She's a monster. How do you sleep at night? Legally, Margaret wasn't entirely wrong. Willow Grove's rules required advance notice for processions, even funerals. On paper, she'd followed the bylaws. But that only fueled the fury. It wasn't that she'd broken the law, it was that she'd chosen to enforce it at the worst possible moment. James watched the chaos unfold from his living room, his laptop glowing with news clips and comments. He wasn't chasing fame or revenge, but something stirred in him. This wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about what people would tolerate in the name of order. Days later, Margaret's interview on Channel 5 sealed her fate. Standing on her pristine lawn, she said, "Emotional situations, no matter how tragic, can't override community protocols. Systems exist for a reason." Her voice was flat, her face expressionless. The backlash was swift. Old HOA complaints resurfaced, fines for a flagpole, a kid's lemonade stand shut down. The community began to fracture. Some defended Margaret's adherence to rules, but most were appalled. Petitions circulated, demanding her removal. Neighbors who once admired her efficiency now crossed the street to avoid her. James hadn't planned to fight, but Margaret's cold detachment broke something in him. He called Laura Bennett, a lawyer known for taking on tough cases. They met at a quiet diner. Laura listened, then said, "She didn't just block a funeral. She obstructed a burial. That's actionable." The lawsuit was filed within days, Carter versus Hensley. The courtroom was packed with neighbors, their silence heavy with anticipation. James took the stand, his voice trembling as he spoke of Lily, her giggles, her hospital drawings, her final wish to see the trees one last time. He played a recording of her voice. "Hi, Daddy. I love you forever." The room wept. Photos of Lily flashed on a screen, baking cookies, hugging her bunny, smiling in a hospital bed. The judge looked away, visibly moved. Margaret represented herself, her demeanor icy. She objected repeatedly, calling James's testimony emotional manipulation and his description of her actions inflammatory. In her closing, she said, "This isn't about a child. It's about process." Exceptions breed chaos. The room fell silent, stunned by her lack of remorse. The judge's verdict was unflinching. Margaret was liable for obstruction of burial and intentional infliction of emotional distress. "Your authority didn't grant you impunity," he said. "You trampled grief." She was ordered to pay damages. Days later, 80% of Willow Grove residents voted to oust her from the HOA, her name erased from all records. 3 months later, the community held a second procession for Lily. No clipboard, no gatekeeper, just a hearse, a father, and a neighborhood that finally understood. Hundreds lined the streets, holding white flowers, their silence reverent. James walked behind the hearse, his steps steady, his eyes wet but calm. From a window, Margaret watched, isolated, irrelevant. At the cemetery, James knelt by Lily's headstone. "Lily Carter, 2017 to 2023. Bright as the moon she loved." He whispered, "I walked you home, sweetheart." We did. Peace, not victory, was what he'd fought for. Justice came quietly, on a cleared road, and a child was honored at last. What do you think? Was Margaret a villain enforcing order, or a victim of rigid rules? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's spark a debate. Where's the line between protocol and compassion? Hit that like button, subscribe, and let's keep this conversation going.